Hey everyone, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, your quiet corner for drifting off to the past. Tonight, as the world outside softens and the shadows lengthen, we're going to embark on a journey not to some distant romanticised land, but to a time, perhaps even more alien than the stars themselves, medieval England. It's a place often imagined through stained glass and heroic tales, but what if you were dropped quite unceremoniously right into its muddy, teeming reality? What would it truly feel like to wake up in a world where every scent, every sound, every unspoken rule felt like a deliberate challenge to your very existence? If you find peace and insight in these historical whispers, a quiet subscribe and a thoughtful like are always appreciated. And it's always a gentle connection to know who's joining us in this historical drift. Feel free to share your location in the comments or simply a quiet emoji. Allow your mind to softly drift as we journey back to a past that was anything but quiet, yet now offers a unique kind of calm. Imagine, if you will, the abruptness of it all. One moment the familiar hum of modern life, perhaps the distant murmur of traffic, or the gentle glow of a screen is your constant companion. The next, an overwhelming, unyielding silence presses in. It's not merely the absence of sound, but a void that feels deeper, more profound than anything you've ever experienced. No distant electricity buzzing, no traffic drone, no digital clock counting away the seconds. Just a jarring, almost unsettling quiet, broken only by the rustle of unseen leaves or the hollow, mournful hoot of an owl somewhere in the vast inky blackness that surrounds you. This immediate sensory deprivation, this sudden absence of the ambient noise that defines your era, would be the first most powerful signal that your world quite literally had shifted on its axis. You're not just in a different place, you're in a different time where time itself feels less a measured commodity and more an amorphous pressing weight. And with this profound quiet comes another assault, this one olfactory. As your eyes strain to adjust to the overwhelming darkness, your nose takes the brunt of the shock. A raw, complex blend of wood smoke, heavy and clinging, mingles with the damp, decaying scent of wet leaves, a hint of fresh manure from unseen animals, and an indescribable musky earthiness that speaks of centuries without paved roads or sanitation systems. This is the unsanitized smell of a world radically different from your own, a pervasive aroma that would cling to your clothes, your hair, and eventually it would seem even to your very skin. It's a constant reminder, more potent than any visual, that the soft comforts of your previous life are irrevocably gone. You find yourself lying directly on cold, damp dirt, the rough texture against your cheek, a brutal counterpoint to the forgotten luxury of a mattress. Any distant light is a mere faint flicker, perhaps a hearth fire showing through the crude wooden shutters of a dwelling too far to offer immediate solace, just a stark, teasing deprivation of true illumination. The cold of the earth beneath you is immediate, unforgiving, and deeply penetrating. Your modern clothes, likely thin and ill-suited for the elements, offer little defence against the pervasive dampness that seems to seep into your bones. This isn't the chill of a conditioned room. It's the raw elemental cold of the pre-industrial world, a constant companion to sleep and waking, and then the stark, chilling realization hits you: total isolation. Your modern phone, a lifeline to your previous existence, lies uselessly in your hand, a mere 3% battery, blinking mockingly, its screen a dark mirror reflecting your own profound vulnerability. No signal, no internet, no contact. It serves as a tangible, agonizing symbol of the severed ties to your own era, emphasizing not just physical isolation, but a deep, unsettling sense of psychological displacement. The world you knew, the people who knew you, the very concept of being connected are utterly irrevocably gone. This isn't the romanticised medieval England of storybooks and folklore where knights were noble and maidens fair and every hardship felt like a picturesque challenge. No, this is a pragmatic, often brutal reality, unforgiving in its simplicity. Every misstep, every deviation from the norm, whether it's the fabric of your clothing, the cadence of your speech, or even a simple gesture that's out of place, could instantly mark you as foreign as an outsider in a society deeply wary of strangers. This isn't just about discomfort, it's about inherent peril. Being marked as foreign could lead to immediate questioning, suspicion, or worse, outright theft. You could be seen as an easy target, someone to exploit, or even in the extreme, find yourself facing forced subservience, your freedom, your autonomy dissolving in the harsh light of a new, utterly alien sun. This unsanitized awakening is a cold splash of reality, preparing you for a daily existence that will redefine every notion of comfort, security, and belonging you once held dear. From that initial unsanitized awakening where discomfort redefined itself daily, the truths of physical existence pressed in with unyielding force. Where you once knew the soft embrace of a bed and the predictable rhythm of an alarm, you now contended with something far more primal. The initial shock of finding yourself not merely in a different location, but truly on the earth, lying directly in cold, damp dirt with the pervasive pitch darkness pressing in from all sides, presented a sensation utterly alien to modern sensibilities. The only distant hint of civilization, a faint flicker of hearth fires seen through crude, imperfectly fitted wooden shutters, served less as a comfort, and more as a mocking reminder of the warmth and light you lacked. This wasn't merely discomfort. It was a profound sensory deprivation, a brutal introduction to the raw material of medieval sleep. As your eyes, once accustomed to electric light, struggled against the overwhelming gloom, the crude architecture of the medieval world began to etch itself into your memory. Typical village homes were not quaint cottages, but often narrow, squat timber frame structures, their walls a rough patchwork of wattle and daub perpetually streaked with mud. Thatched roofs, often leaning at precarious angles, seemed to sag under their own weight, offering only minimal protection from the elements. Comfort was a foreign concept privacy, an unheard-of luxury. Inside, the pervasive scent of animal waste, often from livestock kept under the same roof for warmth, mingled with the inescapable aroma of wood smoke, creating an atmosphere that would constantly assault your senses, reminding you that your personal space was a permeable boundary barely existent. Then there's the sleep itself, a concept utterly reconfigured. Forget the modern ideal of 8 uninterrupted hours. Here you'd quickly learn the rhythm of first sleep and second sleep. You might find yourself waking naturally in the middle of the night, perhaps for hours to tend a dying fire, or in the quiet solitude engaging in hushed prayer, or whispered conversations that now felt perfectly normal in the profound stillness. This ancient broken sleep pattern stands in stark contrast to the continuous deep slumber promoted by modern life, forcing you into a new fragmented rhythm dictated by the sun and the demands of rudimentary survival. Should you be fortunate enough to seek shelter, perhaps at a priory or monastery, the concept of hospitality would be a stark lesson in its limitations. Sleeping. They're often meant sharing a drafty hall corner on rough straw mats packed in with a multitude of other pilgrims, the air thick with the sounds of communal snoring, restless turning, and the occasional muttering from those lost in their dreams or prayers, and always the ever-present insidious concern of bedbugs, tiny unseen companions that brought a persistent unwelcome itch. The pervasive chill of these unheated stone structures, even indoors, would remind you that true warmth was a precious commodity rarely achieved and never taken for granted. Even more rustic and perhaps more common would be the acceptance of accommodation in a farmer's barn. Here the biting cold would necessitate curling into the tightest possible ball within a pile of scratchy hay, its dry stalks prickling against your skin. This wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a living, breathing ecosystem. You'd share this intimate space with snorting cows, their warm breath a surprising comfort, in the cold and dangerously perched chickens, whose sudden movements or unexpected squawks would jar you awake. This highlights the raw animalistic proximity to life that defined daily existence, where the boundaries between human and beast blurred, and personal space was a luxury utterly unknown. In your deepest moments of desperation when human scrutiny felt too dangerous, the ultimate need to find truly hidden refuge would become paramount. This might mean burrowing into a hollow in the earth behind a mossy boulder deep within the forest, a makeshift den that offered not comfort but concealment. Its retreat from human eyes, a desperate act signifying an even deeper, more fundamental integration with the harsh, unforgiving elements. Survival here wasn't about comfort or convenience. It was about mere existence, a relentless dance with the wild, and a profound re-evaluation of what shelter truly meant. That relentless dance with the wild for shelter would swiftly be overshadowed by another fundamental persistent demand: sustenance. Your initial encounters with available food in this new bewildering reality immediately set a low expectation for culinary pleasure. Imagine being offered yesterday's bread, a dense, heavy loaf that tasted of stale grain and hard-won effort, or witnessing something bubbling away in a cookshop pot, its aroma a peculiar mix that could only be described as onions and despair. This wasn't merely unappetizing, it was a stark sensory introduction to the underlying scarcity that governed every medieval meal. Soon you would come to know the ubiquity of pottage. This wasn't a choice, it was the baseline of survival for many. A murky oatmeal-like sludge, made primarily of barley often boiled to a dull grey, its only seasoning a generous helping of salt, or as it might feel to your unaccustomed palate named nembang su tuyet vong. The same pot eternally simmering over an open fire would be constantly refilled, its contents flavoured by timed despair and whatever fell in, which in an unsanitized age was often more than you'd care to consider. This was the omnipresent meal, unappetizing perhaps, but undeniably essential, a caloric anchor in a world of profound uncertainty. The very concept of flavour as you knew it would undergo a radical redefinition. The stark realization would dawn that spices, those everyday enhancers from your former life, were not merely expensive but outright luxuries. A pinch of pepper. A common seasoning today could cost more than a borrowed cloak, placing it firmly out of reach for anyone not of significant means. And fresh meat butcher shops displayed their wares openly, with flies already dancing a macabre jig around cuts that were, to put it mildly, quickly going bad. There was no refrigeration, no modern sanitation, underscoring the general lack of culinary variety and the constant grim battle against spoilage. When it came time to eat, the communal and crude nature of medieval utensils would be another jarring adjustment. Meals were often shared bowls made of splintered wood spoons, equally rough-hewn, frequently wiped on century-old cloths that had seen more grime than hot water. This symbolized not just the rudimentary nature of the meals themselves, but also the pervasive communal living where shared grime was an accepted reality, and personal hygiene, as you understood it, was a distant, forgotten concept. Every meal became an act of surrender to the prevailing conditions. Beyond the communal pot, a forced reliance on foraging would quickly become a bitter reality for supplementing your meagre diet. This was an arduous, risky process. You'd learn to distinguish between wild herbs and roots, understanding that a wrong choice could lead to severe illness or worse. The careful decision to avoid potentially poisonous mushrooms would become a matter of life or death, a skill gleaned through desperate observation or quiet, hurried questions. And the taste. Bitter, unsweetened oat cakes, perhaps laced with wormwood or just bad grain, would become a staple, emphasizing the direct, risky, and often unpalatable engagement with nature simply to stay alive. Perhaps the most visceral and immediate challenge to your internal landscape would be the water sources. The luxury of clean, filtered water, a simple tap, was utterly unimaginable. Here you would drink directly from shallow, algae-slick streams, an act of sheer desperation born from the absence of any modern purification, and the consequence, often immediate regret. The unfiltered earthiness would coat your mouth, and the subsequent severe gastrointestinal distress would be a brutal, inescapable lesson in the microbial reality of medieval Europe. The search for clean water would become a perpetual low-grade anxiety shaping every journey and every desperate sip. That perpetual low-grade anxiety of seeking clean water, a taste that lingered long after the last desperate gulp, would be but one facet of the constant grime that coated every aspect of medieval existence. From the moment of your arrival, your modern shoes designed for paved surfaces and sanitized environments would become instantly caked in packed mud and refuse. The incongruity would be glaring, forcing a quick, pragmatic decision to discard and bury them, a symbolic shedding of your modern skin. This simple act would immediately highlight the ever-present filth, an inescapable reality where dirt wasn't just a surface layer, but an intrinsic part of the landscape clinging to everything and everyone, rendering your previous standards of cleanliness utterly meaningless. The physical manifestations of this perpetual hardship would quickly become your constant companions. You'd find yourself perpetually cold, a deep bone-aching chill that seemed to emanate from within no matter how many layers of rough, scratchy wool you managed to acquire. Dampness pervasive and inescapable would seep into everything, your clothes, your hair, even the very air you breathed. And of course, the dirt, a fine, ever-present layer that coated your skin and worked its way into every crevice. These discomforts would lead to physical symptoms you'd never experienced: cold sweats in the night, persistent shivers that no fire seemed to dispel, and the constant maddening itch of worn, unwashed wool cloaks clinging to your body like wet burlap, a coarse, irritating second skin. Then there's the brutal reality of illness, a concept that would quickly move from abstract historical fact to agonizing personal experience. The sudden onset of severe gastrointestinal issues would be a rude and unforgettable introduction to medieval gastrointestinal reality kicking in. Your modern immune system, finely tuned to a relatively sterile world, would prove utterly catastrophically unprepared for the Emoi Truongjai, Mambenkua medieval Europe. What for locals might be a routine bout of the fluxes would for you rapidly escalate into total physical exhaustion. Kamgias nu moik shuang hopju bitovang tau roi. Every muscle aching, every ounce of energy, drained by a battle your body was ill-equipped to fight. Medical interventions, when they occurred, would be as rudimentary as they were unpalatable. Imagine being given a concoction by a nun, a bitter, leafy substance that tasted disgusting, like someone soaked tree bark in vinegar and sadness. Alongside this would come coarse cloths, perhaps dipped in cool water, pressed to your forehead, offering little more than a fleeting symbolic comfort. These remedies, often based on ancient folklore or rudimentary herbalism, represented the basic unscientific and often agonizingly ineffective treatments available. There was no understanding of germs, no concept of sterile practices, only the desperate hope that nature or faith might intervene. Slowly, inexorably, a process of desensitization to these sensory assaults would begin to take hold. The overwhelming smells that once sent you reeling, the pungent odour of the tannery where animal hides were processed, the raw stench of latrines, often little more than open pits, and the gruesome, sickening aroma of open flaying of animals, would gradually shift from triggering immediate retching and gagging to merely prompting a squint and an accelerated pace. This humbling adaptation, this grudging acceptance of a filthy world, was a profound sign of your unwilling integration, a testament to the human capacity to normalize even the most shocking realities. Yet despite this adaptation, a deep, almost aching longing for modern cleanliness would persist. The simple taken-for-granted amenities of your past life would become distant, idealized luxuries. The thought of a faucet offering a steady stream of cold, clean water would feel like a miracle. Toothpaste, deodorant, proper bandages. These mundane items would transform into objects of profound desire. Even the simple act of washing your face, once a routine, now conjured a burning sensation on your skin due to the harsh, often contaminated water, underscoring the stark, painful contrast in personal comfort and sanitation between your previous life and this thaktaikong to GMQ medieval existence. That burning sensation on your skin after a rudimentary face wash, a constant reminder of the scarcity of true cleanliness, quickly faded into the background as the immediate demand for physical labour asserted itself. Survival in this era was not a matter of choice or intellectual prowess. It was an unrelenting physical grind. Imagine the necessity of quickly engaging in manual tasks like chopping wood for fire or warmth. Within minutes, your unaccustomed hands, soft from a life of keyboards and screens, would be blistered raw and aching. This wasn't a temporary discomfort. It was a clear, harsh understanding that labour is labour and pain is normal in this era. There was no escaping it, no delegate it. It was the fundamental currency of existence. Beyond the immediate aching demands on your hands, another form of labour would present itself, one fraught with peril and governed by unwritten yet brutally enforced rules foraging. You'd quickly learn that collecting even fallen twigs or dry bramble, seemingly innocuous acts, could lead to severe consequences. The wilderness was not free. It was owned every stretch of woodland either held by a noble, claimed by the crown, or attached to a specific estate. To collect wood, to hunt, to gather anything without explicit permission was considered theft, and the penalties were severe: a beating, a hefty fine, or even branding. This highlights the constant, insidious fear of legal repercussions, even for the most basic, desperate acts of survival in a privately owned world. In this context, the social standing of a forest worker, though low, was paradoxically rooted in immense unwritten wisdom. These were the individuals who knew the land with an intimacy modern science could never replicate. They possessed critical knowledge passed down quietly through generations, about which tree bled the cleanest sap for a thirst quencher, which root could break a fever, or in a more macabre but no less vital sense, which patch of moss made the best poultice for drawing pus from a festering wound. This wasn't merely practical information. It was the very essence of localized survival, a silent, vital library of the natural world, utterly divorced from the formal learning of the scribes or the pronouncements of the church. Your days would quickly fall into a relentless physical rhythm, a constant cycle of basic tasks performed merely for sustenance. Sweeping courtyards, a seemingly simple chore, would be an endless battle against mud and refuse. Unloading heavy crates at the docks, the rough wood digging into your shoulders would yield only meagre, hard-won payment. And the ongoing, often frustrating process of haggling for food at the market. Every penny a struggle, every exchange a negotiation would underscore the relentless physical grind of existence. There was no leisure, no rest. Every waking moment was dedicated to the most fundamental aspects of living. This ingrained rhythm of medieval life was not merely demanding. It was pervasive, leaving no room for rest or personal indulgence. You would find yourself waking before the bells of the local church began their mournful toll, driven by the sheer necessity of the day. From dawn to dusk, every effort was geared towards securing basic provisions, enough food to stave off hunger, enough wood to keep warm, enough labour to earn your keep. There was always more to do, a pervasive sense of unending demand that stretched from one sunrise to the next. The very concept of free time as you knew it simply did not exist. Existence itself was the labour. This constant physical engagement, this relentless cycle of securing basic provisions, began to subtly reshape your perspective on the world. The grand narratives of power and faith would recede, replaced by the immediate visceral realities of dirt beneath your nails and the ache in your muscles. The unspoken knowledge of the common folk gleaned from generations of direct interaction with the earth would prove far more valuable than any textbook history you once possessed. This transformation from observer to participant in the Kwok Song Nguyen Ban Kwa medieval daily labour was perhaps the most profound integration of all. That profound integration into the Kwok Song Nguyen Ban Kwa daily labour, marked by aching muscles and dirt-stained hands, would soon be followed by the realisation that physical survival was only one layer of the challenge. Beyond the raw physical demands, the very fabric of social interaction and personal expression demanded meticulous navigation. You would quickly discover that the spoken language itself presented an immediate and profound shock, a barrier far more formidable than you could have anticipated. This wasn't merely Old English, or a quaint understandable dialect. It was Middle English, a brutal, nasal, fast-paced torrent of sounds, splattered liberally with French loanwords and riddled with bewildering regional peculiarities. You would instantly feel more foreign if you tried. To speak it, every attempt a painful, obvious failure. The peril of misunderstanding even the simplest social cues would become terrifyingly apparent. Imagine attempting a nervous laugh at a baker's possibly insulting remark about a hedge priest's sausage, a phrase you might have only half understood if at all. The ensuing awkward silence, punctuated by unreadable stares, would quickly teach you a chilling lesson. Humour in this world was incomprehensible. Its nuances a minefield, and attempting to engage with it a terrifying test of your foreignness. A misplaced chuckle could mark you as a fool, a simpleton, or worse, someone mocking the local customs. When words utterly failed, which would be often the necessity of resorting to extensive miming, would become your primary mode of communication. Rubbing your belly for hunger, pointing at the sun, and closing your eyes for tiredness, every interaction would transform into a desperate charades for survival. This constant, exhausting performance, where gestures replaced grammar and context was cobbled together from desperate observation, would highlight the profound isolation that came with the language barrier. You were in a world of people, yet utterly alone in your inability to articulate even the most basic needs. What you might eventually grasp, perhaps with a subtle shift in your ear, was the striking realization that you could discern social status, who owns land and who sleeps in a ditch, simply by the pronunciation of words and their unique cadence. The way a lord commanded the clipped tones of a merchant, the slurred vowels of a peasant. These were not merely accents. They were profound and immediate audible markers of a rigid class system. This was a language barrier within a language barrier, a layer of social coding you were completely unequipped to decipher, yet one that locals read instinctively from birth. From these painful lessons, a critical rule of survival would emerge: don't talk unless absolutely necessary. Your mouth, once a tool for expression and connection, would become a real liability, a constant threat to your masquerade. A single sentence clumsily pronounced or grammatically flawed by modern standards could instantly mark you as foreign, someone who talks Kunhu, the Ban Van Jang Hoc Jan Van Kua, the Kinai drawing dangerous unwanted scrutiny. Silence often was the only true shield against exposure. Learning the nuanced and critical importance of bowing correctly would be another treacherous test of your social adaptability. A bow too deep to a merchant's wife might lead to open laughter from her and stern, suspicious looks from nearby guards, hinting at a lack of respect or, worse, a mockery of status. Yet a bow that was not precisely the right slight inclination to a higher-ranked individual could result in grave offence or public ridicule. This delicate dance of deference was a complex unwritten code, and failure to master it meant constant social peril, a subtle performance where every tilt of the head was judged. The unspoken rules of gaze would further complicate your interactions. Nobles did not look directly at merchants. Merchants avoided the eyes of peasants, and peasants in turn looked at no one unless directly spoken to. This forced an adaptation to a perpetually lowered gaze, a conscious effort to avoid suspicion or confrontation, to not challenge the established hierarchy with a simple, direct look. This constant self-regulation, this internal choreography was exhausting, yet utterly necessary to avoid being noticed in the wrong way. Ultimately, you would embark on a conscious, tiring effort to become forgettable. This meant shrinking yourself, metaphorically rounding off any modern edges that might draw attention and actively avoiding standing out in any way. You would quickly realise that in the 14th century, invisibility offered the only true safety a stranger could buy. It was a draining, constant performance of self-effacement, where the greatest success was to be utterly unremarkable, to blend into the muddy, teeming backdrop unseen and unremarked upon. That tiring, constant performance of self-effacement, the conscious effort to become utterly unremarkable, extended far beyond mere gestures and silence. In medieval England, clothing itself was a loud, unmistakable language, a visual declaration of one's place in the rigid social order. Your modern synthetic clothes, the jeans, the sweatshirt, the telltale glint of zippers, would be an immediate glaring visual contradiction, an alien appearance that would instantly mark you as an outsider, a lunatic, or worse, someone to be eyed with profound suspicion. The immediate necessity of bearing them a quick and quiet act of disinheritance would be followed by the desperate search for rudimentary linen or coarse wool that almost passes for a tunic, a vital step in avoiding instant ostracization. Understanding this visual code would become paramount for survival. You would quickly discern that fur-lined cloaks weren't just for warmth. They signified power and wealth. Colours too carried specific weight. Blue and purple dyes were incredibly expensive and rare, reserved almost exclusively for nobility, a visual shorthand for untouchable status. And even the cleanliness of linen mattered. It had to appear recently washed, indicating a household with servants, or at least the means to afford soap and labour. Every garment, every thread, every hue was a signal immediately legible to locals communicating your standing or alarming lack thereof before you even uttered a word. Your natural confident modern gait, the way you walked with an unconscious sense of entitlement and personal space, would quickly prove to be too loose, too confident for this world. Here movement itself was a social signal, and you'd find yourself actively mimicking a more submissive posture, not stepping softly enough around a noble, failing to lower your head fast enough when passing a priest, or neglecting to make ample space for higher-ranked individuals on a narrow path. Such missteps could easily lead to being hit for moving wrong, a harsh, immediate correction from those who instinctively understood the physical choreography of deference. Perhaps most counterintuitive to your modern sensibilities was the discovery that a clean face was not a mark of distinction, but rather a profound source of suspicion. In a society where widespread dirt and grime were the norm, where labourers were constantly smudged with earth and soot, a pristine countenance stood out like a beacon. It signalled leisure, lack of toil, and thus suspicion. This necessitated a deliberate, almost absurd effort to apply soot or dust to your skin, a conscious act of self-soiling, to appear more authentic and less anachronistic. Clean faces are suspicious. You would learn a bleak, humorous truth in a world where dirt was synonymous with legitimacy. The public display of belonging was another crucial aspect of social performance. Apprentices, for instance, wore specific pins or stitched symbols on their clothing, visible markers of their trade, their guild, their affiliation. As a time traveller, you would possess no such identifiers, no guild badge, no lord's livery. This lack immediately marked you as a stranger, beneath everyone, unable to prove your place within the intricate web of medieval society. You were an uncredentialed ghost, tolerated perhaps, but never truly accepted. This constant performance of belonging, or rather of not belonging in a dangerous way, would lead to a learned survival tactic, the art of preemptive destitution. You would deliberately cultivate an appearance of having absolutely nothing of value. This meant walking with a slumped, defeated posture, dressing even shabbier than you might otherwise, and perhaps even feigning a limp. The goal was to make potential thieves or suspicious individuals assume ban chang jang je, ke trom kon chung hat bon vovek gi, a desperate form of self-preservation in a world where vulnerability was synonymous with prey. To be overlooked, to be dismissed as utterly worthless, was often the safest state of being in this harsh reality. To be overlooked, to be dismissed as utterly worthless, was indeed the safest state of being in that harsh reality, yet even this performance offered only partial protection against the all-encompassing spiritual frameworks and deep-seated superstitions of the age. As a modern mind dropped into this deeply religious and often fearful world, you'd quickly grasp the profound influence of the Church and the pervasive presence of supernatural belief. Facing the constant suspicion that came with your unplaceable identity, adopting the identity of a pilgrim would emerge as the safest option. Pilgrims were a common sight, expected to be from anywhere, their oddities often attributed to the hardships of their journey or the fervour of their faith. Naming Canterbury or Santiago as your distant destination, even without genuine religious conviction, provided a ready-made narrative, a plausible reason for your solitary wandering. This adopted identity, while a mere facade for you, tapped into a fundamental religious obligation of the church charity. Priories and monasteries were mandated to provide hospitality to travellers, especially pilgrims, offering a rare if meagre mercy in a harsh world. This meant securing lodging, a corner in a draughty hall, a straw mat and basic sustenance, often pottage and stale bread even when you possessed no coin to pay. It was a lifeline, a temporary reprieve from utter destitution, granted not for your worth, but for the perceived sanctity of your journey, a remarkable social safety net that was anchored in divine decree rather than civic responsibility. Within this spiritual landscape, priests often stood as the most educated figures in town, wielding not just moral authority but also considerable social influence. Their role as guardians of moral and spiritual order meant they were inherently suspicious of anything unexplained, anything that seemed out of the ordinary, or, God forbid, magical. A simple, mundane, modern act, perhaps checking your now useless phone, or a spinning compass you instinctively pulled out, could draw their dangerous scrutiny. Such objects, alien and inexplicable, could be perceived as tools of witchcraft or heresy, making even innocent actions fraught with peril. The unexpected peril of performing a seemingly simple modern act could extend beyond mere objects. Imagine in a moment of compassion or desperation cleaning a child's wound with a splash of wine and a clean piece of cloth, rudimentary first aid by your standards. If the wound healed swiftly, and your intervention was observed, it could lead to whispers and accusations of knowing things, of being a mystic, or possessing some uncanny power. This wasn't praise. It was dangerous attention, the kind that could easily lead to suspicion from the very authorities who were meant to protect the community. In a world where illness and injury were often seen as divine punishment, or the work of malevolent forces, rapid healing by an unknown hand was profoundly unsettling. To navigate this landscape of faith and fear, even without genuine belief, you would find yourself engaging in profound acts of social mimicry. During morning prayers in the monastery, or at a communal church service, you would learn to mutter nonsense syllables or echo Latin phrases you had overheard from others. This was not born of piety, but out of absolute necessity, a crucial act of social camouflage to avoid suspicion. To stand silent or appear indifferent would immediately mark you as an outsider, someone without faith, which in this era was almost synonymous with being without a soul and therefore dangerous. It was a performance of piety, a necessary deceit to blend in. Beyond the formal structures of the church, superstition permeated every aspect of daily life, offering explanations for the inexplicable and shaping judgment. The idea that a tax collector's mule might be cursed by a beggar, for example, was not dismissed as folly, but accepted as a plausible explanation for its sudden lameness. This reflected a worldview where magic divine intervention or malevolent spirits explained everyday occurrences from a failed crop to a sudden illness. This deeply ingrained belief system meant that your very presence, your foreignness, could be woven into their existing narrative of omens and curses, making you a potential harbinger of ill luck, or worse, a vessel for dark forces simply for existing outside their known framework. Simply existing outside their known framework indeed could lead to your presence being construed as an omen or a curse, highlighting a deeper, more fundamental truth of medieval existence, the overwhelming weight of clan identity. In this era, the concept of a solitary individual, a just passing through traveller, simply did not exist. This was a world where everyone without exception had to belong. You had to be attached to a household, a guild, a parish, or a specific trade. This wasn't a choice, it was a matter of protection from utter vulnerability. Without such affiliation, you were quite literally fair game exposed to every peril that lurked beyond the protective boundaries of community. The contrast with your modern static identity, the passport, the ID card, the digital footprint could not be more stark. In the medieval reality, your story is your protection. Your identity was a malleable narrative, a carefully crafted background that you would need to constantly rehearse and refine to survive. A pilgrim from the north, you might repeat to yourself, or a humble craftsman seeking work in a new town. This fabricated background wasn't just a convenience. It was your shield, your only defense against relentless questioning and dangerous scrutiny. Your survival depended entirely on the plausibility and consistency of the tale you wove for yourself. This medieval world, you would quickly understand, runs on trust and fear. People out of necessity were often willing to believe the stories of strangers, especially if those stories fit within an accepted archetype like that of a pilgrim or a travelling merchant. But this trust was fragile, always balanced by an underlying fear of the unknown. If you failed to belong, if you lacked the protection of an established network, you became highly susceptible to crime, to theft, or to arrest under suspicion. The system was designed to contain categories, and anyone outside these categories was a threat, or at least a potential problem to be dealt with. The disorienting state of being a blank page was a profound mental struggle. As a time traveller, you didn't fit into any established social category. You weren't noble nor clergy, nor a recognised guild member, nor a peasant tied to the land, nor even a true devout pilgrim. You were an anomaly, a void in their meticulously structured world. This led to a perpetual state of unease where you were merely tolerated but not trusted. You might be allowed to stay to work, to eat, but you would always be watched, always an outsider, never truly integrated into the social fabric. In this context, there was a strange, surprising comfort derived from being misidentified. Perhaps someone would call out, "Watch it, lowborn," mistaking you for a local. This wasn't ideal, of course, but it signified that someone even incorrectly believed they knew who and what you were. It was the closest you could come to belonging in this utterly alien world, a fleeting moment where the crushing weight of your invisibility lifted, replaced by the mistaken identity of a known, if unremarkable, individual. It was a brief taste of being accounted for, even if wrongly. But even with adopted stories and fortunate misidentifications, the silent judgment of nonconformity would be a constant burden. Subtle cues, almost imperceptible to your own consciousness, but glaringly obvious to locals, would betray your foreignness. Hands that were too clean and instinctive flinch at the pervasive smells of the city, too much direct eye contact, or too little. Depending on the recipient, these small deviations from medieval norms would register. You'd catch fleeting but persistent looks of suspicion from locals, their gazes lingering just a moment too long. They might not understand why, but they instinctively recognized difference, a subtle dissonance that whispered of something not right, keeping you forever on edge. That constant feeling of being on edge, the subtle dissonance whispering of something not right to the instinctively aware locals, was not an abstract anxiety. It was forged within the inescapable macro-realities of the era, particularly its rigid hierarchy, fragile economy, and unrelenting environment. The foundational truth of medieval society was its static nature. Most people were born into their station, whether a villain, a serf tied to the land, a tanner, a blacksmith, and were expected to die in it. Social mobility was exceptionally limited, a rare anomaly usually achieved only through the church, offering a path for the literate poor, or through military service, offering a brutal gamble for glory or demise. This created a fixed, almost geological social landscape, where change was measured not in generations but in centuries, a stark contrast to the fluid social ladders of your own time. Central to this unyielding structure was the absolute pervasive power of land ownership. In medieval England, virtually every stretch of woodland, every open field, every river and stream was held by a noble claimed by the crown or attached to a specific estate. This wasn't merely a legal formality. It was a daily reality that governed every aspect of life. Even the seemingly innocuous act of collecting fallen twigs for fuel, as you had learned, could be a potential act of theft, a violation of a powerful lord's property. This highlighted the pervasive, almost suffocating control that land ownership exerted over every individual's life, dictating where they could live, what they could gather, and even where they could walk. The class divide was not merely a theoretical concept. It was visibly and audibly expressed in every interaction. You would quickly learn to read these cues to understand the unspoken language of power dynamics. Lords commanded their voices, carrying an unquestioning authority. Knights strutted their heavy armour and confident bearing, broadcasting their martial prowess and elevated status. Guildsmen, proud of their trade and their hard-won skills, would puff their chests out, a subtle display of their economic and social standing. Peasants, perpetually aware of their subservient position, instinctively looked down, their eyes, averted their movements, deferential, and servants, masters of blending into the background, would seemingly vanish their presence, acknowledged only through their quiet efficiency. These were not conscious choices. They were deeply ingrained motban nung zo hoi unsu, performed instinctively from childhood, a choreography of power that you as an outsider had to learn quickly and painfully. This pervasive hierarchy underscored a critical, terrifying lack of individual rights or legal protection for those who did not belong to a recognised network. To be outside a household, a guild, a parish, or a specific trade was to be utterly exposed. There was no impartial justice system to which a lone, unconnected individual could appeal. You were vulnerable to crime, to arbitrary suspicion, to exploitation, with no one to advocate for you, no one to vouch for your character. This profound imperative of belonging, the absolute necessity of being tethered to a recognised group, would force desperate measures for acceptance, even if only on the periphery. Your life depended on it, for without a place, you were nothing. This stark reality made the concept of anonymity so cherished in modern urban life a terrifying vulnerability. To be unknown was to be unprotected. To be unattached was to be fair game. The sheer scope of this foundational social structure, built on centuries of feudal tradition, dwarfed any individual ambition or desire for independence. It was a vast, immovable edifice, and you, the time traveller, were merely a tiny, fragile anomaly, desperately trying to find a niche within its unyielding walls. Every breath you took, every step you made, was under the silent, powerful shadow of this hierarchy, constantly defining the boundaries of your existence. That constant definition of your existence by the shadow of an unyielding social hierarchy was inextricably linked to the core economy and the meticulous, often brutal realities of resource management. Having grown up with fixed prices and digital transactions, you would immediately confront a world where barter was the dominant exchange. The absence of clearly marked prices meant that every single transaction, from a loaf of bread to a piece of cloth, was a negotiation, a subtle dance of leverage and need. You'd quickly find yourself bartering goods you might acquire, perhaps a few eggs if you were lucky enough to earn them a piece of cheese or some root vegetables gleaned from a kind soul. And the currency itself, silver pennies, half pennies, farthings, unfamiliar often, worn and baffling in their denominations. Your lack of familiarity would immediately make you vulnerable to being fleeced, taken advantage of by sharp-witted locals who could spot a bewildered stranger a mile away. The weekly market day was not merely a place of commerce, it was the vibrant, chaotic heart of medieval community life, the true economic hub. Here, rural folk from the surrounding villages brought their meagre goods to sell: grains, eggs, simple crafts, perhaps a scrawny chicken. It was the primary nexus for commercial exchange, but also a vital social gathering, a place where news was exchanged, rumours spread and connections forged. For the uninitiated, however, it was a dangerous, overwhelming environment. The cacophony of voices, the press of bodies, the unfamiliar goods, and the constant threat of opportunists made it a place of both necessity and extreme caution. Your modern palate, accustomed to global cuisine and readily available flavours, would be shocked by the exorbitant cost of luxuries. Spices, as you already learned, were not just expensive, they were astronomically so. A pinch of pepper, a common condiment in your time, could literally cost more than your borrowed cloak, a rough garment you might have acquired through desperate means. This stark reality highlighted the profound economic disparity of the age and the severely limited access to even basic comforts for the common folk, whose diet, as you had already discovered, was monotonously simple and unvaried. True culinary pleasure was a privilege of the elite utterly beyond your grasp. Adding to the pervasive sense of precariousness was the grim reality that petty theft was not an outlier, but part of the natural order. It wasn't condemned with the same moral outrage as in your modern world. It was openly accepted, almost priced into everything. Locals carried their meagre valuables in hidden pouches sewn into the very linings of their coarse clothes, a testament to the constant threat and pervasive desperation that made small-scale crime an undeniable part of daily life. The casualness with which theft occurred was a chilling indicator of the lack of formal protection and the desperate scramble for survival. And beneath the surface of the bustling markets and the quiet village lanes, a shadow economy thrived. Organised gangs of cut purses, nimble-fingered thieves who could relieve you of your coin pouch in a crowded street, operated alongside highwaymen who preyed on travellers. Fences those who bought and resold stolen goods completed this illicit ecosystem. Even seemingly respectable spaces like churchyards, bustling with pilgrims, and taverns filled with noisy patrons, served as prime hunting grounds for these opportunistic thieves, making public spaces a constant source of potential danger. Every step outside your meagre shelter was a gamble against the unseen forces of desperation. The relentless pressure of the core economy was further underscored by the omnipresent concern of taxes. The local bailiff's main job, you would observe, was not to maintain peace or solve disputes, but primarily to ensure that these taxes were paid. This highlighted the constant financial burden on the populace, a heavy weight that pressed down on every household, every individual. The authorities' primary focus was revenue collection, often at the expense of individual well-being or the provision of public services. It was a world where you paid simply for the privilege of existing, and where every earned penny was potentially earmarked for the Lord or the Crown. That constant financial burden, the ever-present shadow of the bailiff and his relentless pursuit of taxes, was but one facet of the harsh, unyielding macro-realities of medieval England. More fundamentally, you would come face to face with nature's relentless fury and the universal threats that permeated every aspect of existence, shaping life in ways your modern mind could barely conceive. The pervasive unsanitized environment was a constant tactile reality. Roads were not paved but merely packed earth deeply scored by cart ruts, frequently transforming into treacherous bogs after rain. They were often flooded and after a freeze slick with dangerous ice, making travel difficult, dirty and dangerous. This constant exposure to cold, damp and mud contributed to an overwhelming sense of grime, a perpetual coating that no amount of effort could truly remove. Within this environment, your own body became a battleground against a silent, pervasive enemy. The profound vulnerability to disease would be a chilling realization. Your immune system, exquisitely adapted to the relatively clean and controlled conditions of the modern world, was utterly unprepared for the rung-ram-vi-quan-qua medieval Europe. This would lead to the rapid onset of severe gastrointestinal issues, as you had already experienced, but also persistent coughs, skin infections from minor abrasions and fevers that could quickly escalate into life-threatening conditions. Without any understanding of germ theory, proper sanitation or effective medicine, every cut, every meal, every breath was a potential vector for illness, a silent, pervasive threat that lurked everywhere. Indeed, illness was not a surprise. It was an inevitable, expected companion and an intrinsic part of life. There was a cultural acceptance of its presence, a stoic endurance of suffering. People rarely discussed their symptoms in detail, nor did they hold strong expectations of full recovery. Medicine improvised and often ineffective was more about managing discomfort or offering spiritual comfort than actual cure. This created a profound fatalistic attitude towards sickness and death, where life's fragility was not a philosophical concept, but a daily visceral reality that you too would come to accept with a grim resignation. The statistical reality of life in medieval England was brutally clear and would cast a long shadow over every interaction. Horrific infant mortality rates meant that many children would not survive beyond their first few years, a heartbreaking yet normalized tragedy. And for those who did survive childhood, the average life expectancy hovered grimly around 35 years, though some of course lived much longer. This emphasizes the extreme fragility of life, where death was not a distant possibility, but a constant, close companion lurking around every corner, a shadow that seemed to fall on even the most vibrant of lives, shaping attitudes towards love loss and the very meaning of existence. Even the wilderness, seemingly a refuge, held its own array of inherent perils. Despite the absence of the great predators like wolves and bears that once roamed earlier European forests, other dangers persisted. Wild boars, fiercely territorial and capable of inflicting serious injury, roamed freely. Swarms of hornets could turn a foraging expedition into a painful ordeal. But most significantly, the greatest threats lurking in the wilderness were human. Bandits, escaped serfs, and outlaws, desperate individuals living outside the law, often found refuge in the dense woods. This made foraging that necessary act of supplementing your diet, a constant gamble against both natural and human predators, forcing you to move with an awareness and caution you had never known. Every aspect of this raw, untamed existence, from the muddy tracks you walked to the air you breathed, whispered of the tenuousness of life. The constant battle against the elements, against unseen microbial armies, and against the very real dangers of desperate humanity would forge within you a new appreciation for mere survival. You would no longer see yourself as an individual separate from nature, but as inextricably linked to its rhythms, its dangers, and its fleeting moments of grace. This deep, profound understanding of nature's relentless fury would become an indelible part of your medieval identity. That indelible understanding of nature's relentless fury and the pervasive fragility of life would quickly broaden to encompass the unyielding power hierarchy in practice, a system that dictated every aspect of existence, shaping how life was enforced, endured, and occasionally subtly resisted. Your first encounter with this overt control would likely be at the gates of a town. These were not merely architectural features, they were physical manifestations of structured control primarily designed to keep animals and thieves out. Often these gates were accompanied by curfews slamming shut at dusk and restricted entry after dark, symbolizing a clear boundary, a mechanism regulating movement and determining precisely who could enter and leave a defined community. This tangible control over physical movement was mirrored by an even more fundamental intangible one, the absolute necessity of belonging to someone. As you had begun to grasp, there was no such thing as a just passing through traveller in medieval England. To exist was to be affiliated to a household, a guild, a parish, or a trade. This wasn't a social custom. It was a cornerstone of governance and control, a pervasive network of social oversight. To be outside, it was not merely an inconvenience. It was a grave danger rendering you utterly exposed and without protection. The stark consequence of not belonging to such a network was profound vulnerability. Without a lord to vouch for you, a guild to protect your interests, or a parish to claim you as one of its own, you were completely exposed to crime, arrest, or simple suspicion. There was no one to advocate for you, no one to offer sanctuary or intercede on your behalf in a system designed exclusively for the established, for those neatly categorized within its rigid framework. You were a loose thread, an unattached entity, and thus a potential threat and an easy target for exploitation or arbitrary justice. This constant state of being an unattached entity, a perpetual outsider, would exact a heavy mental and emotional toll. The daily navigation of a rigid social structure by striving for invisibility, by suppressing your true identity, and by performing constant mimicry to avoid being noticed or questioned, was an exhausting endeavour. It demanded a permanent state of heightened alertness, a constant self-censorship, and a deep-seated anxiety that every interaction could be the one that exposed you. To be unremarkable, to be forgotten by the memory of the medieval mind, became your ultimate goal, a form of peace found only in self-erasure. This was further reinforced by the cascading chain of obedience that permeated every social interaction. You would witness and quickly learn to participate in this instinctive, culturally ingrained system of submission and authority. Lords command their authority absolute and unquestioned. Knights strut their martial power a visible deterrent. Guildsmen puff their chests, proud of their earned status and economic clout. Peasants look down, their gazes lowered in automatic deference. And servants vanish into the background, their presence almost imperceptible, their efficiency a quiet testament to their place. These were not conscious choices. They were deeply ingrained, a fin savoir performed instinctively from childhood, a choreography of power that you as an outsider had to internalize to survive. Every gesture, every word, every averted gaze became part of this complex, unwritten contract of submission and authority. To misunderstand or defy this system even inadvertently was to invite swift, often brutal correction. The inherent power imbalance was a tangible force shaping not only grand political decisions, but also the most mundane daily interactions. It was a constant reminder that in medieval England, true personal freedom as you understood it was a dangerous myth, replaced by a meticulously enforced hierarchy that left little room for individual agency or escape. That meticulously enforced hierarchy, leaving little room for individual agency or escape, found its most tangible and often brutal expression in the legal and enforcement mechanisms of the age. Your modern mind, accustomed to a structured, institutionalized system of justice, would confront the stark realization that there was no police station, no mounted guards patrolling with notepads and radios, no 911 dispatcher. This immediate absence of formal immediate protection for the average person would leave you acutely aware of your vulnerability, a chilling understanding that help as you knew it simply did not exist. the limited reach of justice as understood by your standards would become quickly apparent. The local bailiff, the omnipresent figure of authority, was primarily focused on specific narrow tasks, collecting taxes, protecting the interests and property of the landowner, and maintaining a semblance of order in public spaces, particularly taverns. Investigating petty theft, especially if it involved an unknown foreigner like yourself, was low on his list of priorities, if it made the list at all. You would quickly learn that an unknown foreigner won't get justice in this system. Your grievances, no matter how legitimate, would likely be met with indifference or a sympathetic but ultimately dismissive shrug. And when justice was meted out, its nature was both inconsistent and brutally severe. Punishments for theft, even minor infractions, ranged wildly and were often gruesome. Public humiliation at the pillory with rotten turnips thrown by an unforgiving crowd was a common spectacle. But for repeat offenders or more significant thefts, the consequences escalated dramatically. The loss of a hand or an ear, a branding iron searing a permanent mark onto your flesh, or in the gravest cases even hanging. This made engaging with the law a terrifying lottery, a gamble with potentially irreversible consequences, a stark reminder that life and limb were cheap. Even more terrifying were the strict forest laws and their extreme penalties. These were not merely rules, they were instruments of control designed to protect the lord's property and his hunting rights. Chopping down trees for firewood, setting a simple snare for a deer, acts that might seem innocuous for survival were deemed capital offences. Being caught with the wrong bundle of sticks could result in being beaten, fined, or even branded. For more serious violations, the consequences could be as extreme as hanging, mutilation, or severe flogging. These laws demonstrated the disproportionate power of property rights over human life, a casual brutality that made every step outside the village a potential walk into a death trap. The futility of reporting crime to locals would further underscore your isolation. Attempts to explain a theft would often be met with laughter, a grim kind of amusement at your naivete, or sympathetic but ultimately dismissive prayers. "May God have mercy on your soul," they might say, offering spiritual comfort in lieu of practical help. This highlighted a stark truth for commoners. Justice was rarely served, and crime was not an aberration, but an accepted, pervasive part of life, something to be endured and survived through cunning, rather than reliance on a non-existent authority. This deeply embedded understanding of arbitrary, often brutal legal mechanisms would force a fundamental shift in your perspective. You would no longer see laws as protections, but as instruments of power, designed to maintain order and privilege for the few. Your existence would become a constant act of evasion, a careful dance around the myriad ways the system could crush you, not for malice, but simply for being outside its prescribed boundaries. Every action, every decision would be weighed against the terrifying, unpredictable scales of medieval justice. That constant, careful dance around the myriad ways the medieval legal system could crush you would be further amplified by the omnipresent shadow of death and the peculiar societal control wielded by notions of honour. For you, the time traveller, the immediate danger of being marked as too foreign, too different by your clothing, your unusual speech, or your inexplicable behaviour was a persistent, gnawing fear. While burning as a witch was a terrifying possibility, in some contexts the more immediate pervasive threat was simply being talked about, questioned, and possibly robbed or worse. This was a constant low-grade risk, a social gauntlet that the uninitiated were forced to run simply by existing. The price of even seemingly minor forest infractions, as you'd already learned, was terrifyingly real and immediate. Being caught with that wrong bundle of sticks, perhaps just a few dry branches for a fire, could instantly result in a brutal beating, a crippling fine, or even a public branding, a permanent scar of your transgression. And for what was considered a more serious offence like poaching a rabbit on a lord's land, the penalty could escalate to outright hanging. This demonstrated the casual arbitrary brutality of legal enforcement, where property rights held a chillingly higher value than human life, and a misstep in the woods could lead to utter ruin. The gravity of miscommunication in this world was perhaps the most terrifying revelation. You would learn through painful observation, if not direct experience, that words can get you hurt. A single bad sentence, a phrase that sounded blasphemous, a remark that hinted at sedition, or simply something so utterly incomprehensible that it raised immediate suspicion could instantly lead to you being labelled a heretic, a spy, or just not right in the head. In a society with no formal system for recourse, no due process, no opportunity for apology or clarification, such a label could be a death sentence, making every casual conversation a perilous test of your ability to conform, or at least to remain utterly innocuous. This constant peril led to a critical unspoken lesson that would define your survival strategy. Interesting people get noticed, and noticed people get questioned, and questioned people get tested. The chain of events was inexorable, leading invariably to exposure and danger. Therefore, your ultimate goal became to be uninteresting, to be forgettable. It was a draining, constant performance of self-effacement, requiring you to actively suppress any natural curiosity, any unique perspective, any inclination to stand out. You don't want to be tested. You would repeat to yourself, understanding that the test would reveal your alien nature and likely lead to your demise. The constant underlying threat of the most severe punishments, being dragged before a magistrate on trumped-up charges facing public trial, or even summary execution, was a pervasive backdrop to your daily life. This was the ultimate consequence of failing to blend in, of betraying your foreign identity too profoundly. It meant living perpetually on a razor's edge, every interaction a potential pitfall, every new acquaintance a possible informer. The very air you breathed seemed to hum with the quiet menace of a world that had little patience for the unknown, and even less for those who could not explain their place. Life in medieval England for you then would indeed transform into a daily tightrope walk, across a chasm of incomprehension and rigid social codes. Every moment would be a lesson in adaptation, every breath a quiet prayer for anonymity. Survival in its most brutal, unadorned form would become the only victory, a constant, exhausting pursuit, and disappearing, fading into the background, becoming a silent, unremarkable part of the human landscape, would ironically be the closest thing you could ever achieve to peace, a strange solace, found only in absolute self-effacement. That strange, hard-won solace found in absolute self-effacement was, however, a fragile and exhausting peace demanding a continuous internal performance that wore at the very fibre of your being. Beyond the visible struggles for food and shelter, there lay a profound mental and emotional toll, a quiet corrosion of the spirit that came with living a lie perpetually on guard. Imagine the sheer weariness of always having to think before you spoke, of censoring your natural reactions, of constantly performing a role that was fundamentally alien to your true self. The constant sensory bombardment, the pervasive smells of unwashed bodies and animal waste. The relentless dampness, the ever-present chill would create a persistent low-grade discomfort that burrowed deep, affecting not just your body, but your very psyche. Your mind would adapt, certainly beginning to filter out the most offensive odours to normalise the pervasive dirt, but this adaptation came at a cost, a dulling of the senses that simultaneously made life bearable and subtly diminished its vibrancy. The psychological weight of your profound isolation, even when surrounded by teeming crowds in the market or huddled around a communal fire, would be a constant aching reality. The language barrier, that cacophony of Middle English coupled with the rigid social codes you couldn't fully comprehend, meant that truly connecting with another human being felt like an insurmountable task. You were in essence a ghost in their midst, unable to share your fears, your knowledge, or your past. The feeling of being a blank page, of having no history that was legible to them, created a desperate, urgent need to fabricate a persona, to constantly rehearse a plausible, unremarkable narrative that could withstand scrutiny. This wasn't merely a practical necessity, it was a profound act of self-preservation that chipped away at your own sense of identity, forcing you to bury your true self deeper and deeper within. Adding to this burden was the relentless stress of constant vigilance. Every interaction, from a simple exchange with a baker to a passing encounter with a guard, became a test. Every word you uttered, every gesture you made was scrutinized, judged against an unspoken code you could only perfectly deduce. The fear of being interesting, of inadvertently drawing unwanted attention to your foreignness, became a pervasive anxiety. To be noticed was to be questioned, and to be questioned was to risk exposure with potentially dire consequences. So you learn to shrink, to observe silently from the periphery, to cultivate an aura of utter unremarkableness. It was a tiring, constant internal struggle, the price of anonymity paid in perpetual anxiety. This confluence of sensory assault, profound isolation, and constant fear would lead to a chilling loss of personal agency. The concept of self-determination, so fundamental to your modern identity, would simply evaporate. Your daily existence would be dictated not by your choices, but by the immediate demands of survival, the rigid structures of the feudal system, and the ever-present threat of judgment or arbitrary justice. You are perpetually under scrutiny, not necessarily malicious, but simply by virtue of being an anomaly in a society that valued conformity and belonging above all else. This constant feeling of being observed, of being an outsider peering in, would lead to a subtle but profound reshaping of your inner world, dulling your responses and teaching you a chilling patience. Your very posture would change, mirroring the submissive gaits of the common folk, not out of respect, but out of necessity. Your eyes, once accustomed to making direct contact, would learn to lower themselves, to deflect, to become a quiet observer, rather than an active participant. Even the small unconscious habits of modern life, a quick glance at a non-existent watch, a familiar gesture, would have to be ruthlessly suppressed. This was not just adaptation. It was a forced metamorphosis, a shedding of your inherent you-ness in favour of a quiet, unassuming shell. The goal was not to live, but to survive, and in that stark differentiation lay a profound kind of peace, albeit one born of resignation. This acceptance of your diminished self, however, would subtly manifest in the very rhythms of your new medieval routine, shaping how you perceived and interacted with the mundane yet vital tasks of each day. The subtle yet profound reshaping of your inner world and the acceptance of a diminished self subtly manifested in the very rhythms of your new medieval routine, shaping how you perceived and interacted with the mundane yet vital tasks of each day. Your new identity, a patchwork of borrowed mannerisms and carefully curated silence, began to feel less like a performance and more like a second skin, albeit one that constantly chafed. The raw elemental comforts of the earth and the pervasive sense of wood smoke and dampness would no longer be jarring assaults, but rather the unavoidable backdrop to your waking hours. You might even find a strange quiet familiarity in the rhythm of the wind through the thatch or the distant lowing of cattle. Sounds that once signified discomfort now simply were. The morning's call not of an alarm, but of the first hints of grey light filtering through crude window openings, became your innate signal to rise. The cold of the earth, once a shock, would be a daily companion met with a practised shiver rather than a gasp. Your search for basic provisions, a piece of stale bread, a handful of nuts if you were lucky enough to forage them, would be immediate, driven by a hunger that was less about appetite and more about the body's primal need for fuel. Every meal, no matter how monotonous, would be consumed with a quiet, almost ritualistic gratitude, for you now understood the profound struggle that went into acquiring even the simplest sustenance. The physical labour which once blistered your hands and ached your muscles transformed from a burden into a purpose. Chopping wood, Carrying water from the well, sweeping a courtyard, these tasks once alien became your daily liturgy, a meditative engagement with the tangible world. The pain would still be present, yes, but it would now be a familiar ache, a testament to your efforts, a sign that you were contributing, however marginally, to the collective survival. There was no room for introspection during these moments, only the rhythm of the work, the direct feedback of your body against the elements of profound grounding in the immediate present. Your interactions, though still limited by language and social barriers, evolved. You learned to read faces to interpret the subtle shifts in expression, the narrowing of eyes, the softening of a brow. A nod from a local, a shared grunt of effort, a quiet offering of a small piece of cheese. These fleeting moments of connection, stripped of linguistic complexity, held immense weight. They were glimpses of acceptance, however tenuous, a fleeting validation that your silent performance was at times sufficient. You learned to distinguish between genuine suspicion and mere curiosity, between a threat and a simple, uncomprehending stare. Even the brutal reality of illness that Jai Man Ben Moi Truong Visin Vat began to settle into a grim predictability. The stomach cramps, the coughs, the fevers, you wouldn't welcome them, but you would approach them with a fatalistic resignation rather than panic. You learned to rest when your body demanded it, to seek out the quiet comfort of a hidden nook, and to accept the simple, often ineffective remedies offered by a compassionate soul. The fear of death would remain, but it would be less a sharp terror and more a quiet understanding. A constant companion in a world where life itself was a fragile, fleeting gift. This relentless, quiet adaptation, this profound integration into the minutiae of medieval daily life slowly rewired your brain. The frantic pace of the modern world, the constant demand for stimulation and progress receded into a dim memory. You lived in the immediate, in the tangible, in the cyclical rhythm of dawn and dusk, labour and rest, hunger and meagre sustenance. This forced simplicity, this stripping away of every modern convenience and expectation, revealed a stark, unvarnished existence, a tapestry woven with threads of hardship endurance, and the quiet, persistent pulse of human survival. That stark, unvarnished existence, a tapestry woven with threads of hardship and endurance, further revealed itself in the profound ways time was perceived and acted upon. In your past life, time was a precise, measured commodity marked by clocks and schedules. Here it was amorphous, dictated not by gears and hands, but by the sun, the seasons, and the tolling of church bells. The rhythm of first sleep and second sleep, once a curious historical fact, became your lived reality, breaking the night into segments that allowed for reflection, prayer, or simply quiet contemplation in the profound darkness. This ancient pattern, so different from your 8-hour modern ideal, forced a deep re-evaluation of rest and productivity, where the stillness of midnight could be as valuable as the bustle of noon. Beyond the sleep cycles, the very concept of leisure, as you knew it, dissolved. There were no weekends, no structured breaks, no dedicated hours for recreation in the modern sense. Every waking moment not dedicated to direct labour for survival, chopping wood, fetching water, mending clothes, or haggling for food, was spent in activities that directly supported the continuity of life. Even social gatherings like market days or church festivals were often tinged with commercial necessity or spiritual obligation, rather than pure, unadulterated recreation. The persistent sense of more to do, that ingrained rhythm of relentless effort, became a permanent fixture of your consciousness, a profound shift from a life of abundant free time. The very concept of news and information flow was fundamentally altered. Gone were the instant updates, the global reach of the internet, the endless stream of notifications. In medieval England, news travelled slowly by word of mouth, by travelling merchants or pilgrims, or by the town crier's resonant voice. Rumours spread like wildfire, often distorted and embellished, becoming the primary source of understanding distant events. This profound lack of immediate information forced a new kind of patience, a reliance on fragmented narratives, and a keen eye for subtle local cues to understand the wider world. What you once took for granted as a constant benevolent hum of connectivity was replaced by a profound information vacuum, leaving you constantly a step behind. The communal nature of medieval life, born out of necessity and reinforced by custom, also reshaped your understanding of individual space and personal belongings. Your modern concept of privacy, a carefully guarded sanctuary, was utterly non-existent. Homes were small, often shared with multiple family members or even livestock. Possessions were few and often communal. This blurred boundary between self and community meant that even the simple act of eating involved shared rough-hewn utensils wiped on cloths that had seen countless meals. This constant proximity, while offering some security in numbers, also meant a profound loss of personal autonomy and a heightened awareness of every gesture and sound you made. The cyclical nature of medieval life, tied intrinsically to the seasons, became your new internal clock. The brutal cold of winter, dictating a focus on warmth and stored provisions, gave way to the frantic energy of spring planting. Summer brought the intensity of harvest, a time of communal effort, and often desperate toil, while autumn signalled the preparations for the lean months ahead. This profound connection to the earth's rhythms, this intimate dance with the turning year, was a stark contrast to the climate-controlled season, agnostic existence of your past. Your very body learned to anticipate these shifts, becoming more attuned to the subtle signs of changing weather and the demands they would place upon your survival. This deep immersion into the fabric of medieval daily routines, from the segmented sleep to the cyclical labour, instilled a profound sense of temporal displacement. You wouldn't just be in the past, you would become of the past, slowly internalising its rhythms and its relentless demands. The very idea of returning to your former life with its dizzying speed and overwhelming abundance might begin to feel strangely alien, a distant, almost incomprehensible dream. This quiet, unconscious assimilation, however, carried its own hidden burden, a unique form of existential loneliness that set you apart even as you tried desperately to blend in. That quiet, unconscious assimilation, carrying its own hidden burden of existential loneliness, was further tested by the relentless human element, the specific interactions and challenges unique to navigating medieval personalities. Beyond the broad social codes, you encountered individuals, each a product of their brutal, beautiful world, and your interactions with them defined your daily trajectory. The local priest, often the most educated and respected figure, could be both a source of spiritual guidance and a figure of profound suspicion. His keen intellect, while perhaps limited by medieval paradigms, would be quick to spot an anomaly, making any casual conversation with him a carefully calibrated exercise in innocuousness. Then there were the merchants, often sharp-witted and pragmatic, their lives built on negotiation and opportunity. Haggling with them for food or simple goods wasn't just about price. It was a battle of wits, a test of your understanding of local values and customary exchange. Your lack of familiarity with their currency, your clumsy attempts at barter, would mark you as vulnerable, and they, being shrewd, would not hesitate to fleece you if the chance arose. Their transactions were less about fixed prices and more about a fluid dance of perceived value, a dance you were forced to learn on the fly, with every misstep potentially costing you precious sustenance. The peasants, the vast majority of the population, often seemed to exist in a world apart, their lives dominated by agricultural rhythms and the demands of their lords. Their suspicion of outsiders, though often quiet, was deep-seated, born of generations of hardship and the inherent dangers of the unknown. Earning even a flicker of their trust would be a monumental achievement, typically only garnered through shared labour and consistent, unassuming behaviour. They might offer a shared meal, a quiet gesture of solidarity, but their lives were too precarious for sustained charity or unearned camaraderie. Their practicality and stoicism, born of constant struggle, would be a stark contrast to the emotional openness you might have known. Beyond these archetypal figures, you would encounter the sheer human variety, each shaped by the stark realities of the age. The village idiot, whose pronouncements might be dismissed by locals as harmless ramblings, could unknowingly utter a truth that resonated deeply with your unique perspective, offering a fleeting, strange connection. The local bully, a figure of small-scale tyranny, would be a constant reminder of the lack of formal justice and the need to avoid confrontation. The quiet, watchful elder whose eyes seemed to hold centuries of unwritten knowledge could be a source of invaluable subtle wisdom if you were patient and humble enough to observe. These individual interactions, often brief and transactional, would force you to become an acute observer of human behaviour far beyond what your modern life required. You'd learn to read body language with a precision born of necessity, to gauge intent from a flicker of an eye or the subtle tension in a shoulder. Every smile, every frown, every casual gesture carried weight, a potential signal of acceptance or suspicion. This intense focus on the micro-expressions of others would become a vital, exhausting skill, a constant act of social decoding that shaped your every move. The underlying tension of these interactions was that you could never fully reveal yourself. Every conversation was a performance, every shared moment tinged with the secret of your origin. This constant internal censor, this need to maintain the pilgrim from the north facade, would create an emotional distance even in moments of fleeting connection. You would learn to appreciate the small kindnesses, a shared piece of bread, a warm corner by a fire, but always with the knowledge that these connections were built on a foundation of necessary deceit. This quiet internal burden, this unshared secret would be the silent perpetual companion of your medieval journey. That quiet internal burden, that unshared secret of your origin, would forever colour your perceptions even when encountering the grander, more public spectacles of medieval life. The church, as the paramount institution, was omnipresent, its imposing structures often dominating the landscape. Its bells dictated the hours of the day, their sonorous chimes marking not just religious services, but also the rhythm of labour and rest for the entire community. Services themselves, conducted in Latin, would be largely incomprehensible to you, forcing another act of quiet mimicry, bowing, kneeling, muttering, along with familiar-sounding syllables to avoid drawing attention. Yet the sheer devotion of the congregants, their profound faith, would be a palpable force, a cultural anchor that revealed the spiritual heart of the age deeply alien to a secular modern mind. Feast days and religious festivals, while ostensibly joyous celebrations, were also profoundly shaped by the scarcity and hardship of daily life. The communal sharing of food, the rare indulgence in richer fare, the colourful decorations all would stand in stark contrast to the usual monotony. These were moments of collective release, brief respites from the relentless grind. But even in their revelry there would be an underlying current of earnest piety, a focus on saints and spiritual blessings, a reminder that these celebrations were not merely entertainment, but acts of devotion deeply intertwined with the church's calendar and its influence over every aspect of societal life. Beyond the spiritual, the agricultural calendar was the lifeblood of existence, dictating the very survival of the community, and by extension, your own. The annual cycle of planting, tending and harvesting was not merely a series of tasks, but an all-encompassing rhythm. The frantic, back-breaking toil of harvest season, when every able body was pressed into service, was a desperate race against the elements, the success or failure of which determined the sustenance for the entire coming year. The communal effort, the shared anxiety of impending famine, or the quiet relief of a bountiful yield forged a profound unspoken bond among the villagers, a deep collective understanding of their shared fate inextricably tied to the land. This deep reliance on the land was often intertwined with superstitions and folk beliefs that shaped daily practices as much as formal doctrine. Rituals to bless the fields, charms to ward off blight, the belief in fey folk influencing the harvest. These were not mere quaint stories, but active components of their worldview, shaping decisions and anxieties. You would witness practices that baffled your scientific mind, yet you would learn to respect their deeply ingrained significance, understanding that for them these beliefs offered a sense of control, a way to navigate a world that was otherwise governed by unpredictable forces of nature and divine will. Market days, as you had already experienced, were microcosms of both economic necessity and social interaction. Beyond the bartering and the occasional theft, they were vital nodes for the exchange of information. Here you might catch snippets of news from other villages, rumours of distant wars or changes in noble allegiances. The sheer vibrancy and chaos of these events, the smells of various goods, the clamour of voices, the sight of people from different walks of life momentarily converging, would offer a fleeting glimpse into the wider interconnected world beyond your immediate village, a world that was both vast and intensely local. In these glimpses of medieval public life, from the solemnity of church services to the bustling energy of the market, you would continue to observe the intricate dance of social performance. The way people dressed, the way they held themselves, the subtle nuances of their speech all reinforced the rigid hierarchy. You, the perpetual outsider, would learn to read these signals to understand the subtle power dynamics at play, recognizing that every public gathering was a stage where identity was performed and reinforced. This constant observation, this quiet analysis of their Benningshoyansu, would be your ongoing lesson in blending in, disappearing into the backdrop of a vibrant yet deeply structured world. That constant observation, that quiet analysis of their Benningshoyansu, as you tried desperately to blend into the vibrant yet deeply structured world, would extend to the mechanisms of conflict and the subtle ways dissent might manifest. While outright rebellion might be rare and brutally suppressed, the seeds of discontent were often sown in the daily injustices and the pervasive power imbalances. For you, this understanding would deepen your already profound sense of vulnerability. You would witness, or at least hear, whispers of the daily abuses of power by local lords or their bailiffs' arbitrary fines, forced labour, or the casual confiscation of peasant produce. These were not grand dramatic conflicts, but the grinding everyday oppressions that chipped away at morale and fostered a deep simmering resentment, usually expressed in quiet grumbles rather than open defiance. The localized nature of justice, as you had experienced, meant that any personal grievance had little recourse outside of the immediate power structure. If a peasant's pig was stolen, or if a minor dispute arose, the resolution rarely came from a neutral external authority. Instead, it was often mediated by the lord's reeve or bailiff, whose judgment would invariably favour the powerful or those with connections. This consistent lack of true justice fostered a culture where minor infractions, if not addressed by the community itself, would simply be endured, adding to the silent accumulation of indignities that defined the lives of the lower classes. Even the pervasive presence of violence, both personal and systemic, would reveal the raw edges of medieval conflict. Duels of honour between knights, brutal fistfights in taverns, or the swift, merciless punishment of criminals were not uncommon. This wasn't the distant, sanitised violence of modern media. It was immediate, personal, and often public. You would witness the casual brutality of the world, perhaps a public flogging for a minor transgression, or the chilling sight of a gallows on the outskirts of town. This constant proximity to physical pain and the arbitrary nature of its infliction would solidify your understanding that the consequences of missteps were not merely social, but potentially devastatingly physical. The occasional arrival of soldiers, whether part of a lord's retinue or marching to a distant campaign, would bring with it an immediate shift in the atmosphere. Their presence, often demanding quarter and provisions, was a heavy burden on local communities, while they offered a form of protection against external threats. They also represented a new layer of demand and potential disruption. Their casual authority, their weapons, and their detached professionalism would highlight the ever-present shadow of larger conflicts, wars fought for distant kings or territorial gains, which nonetheless impacted the common folk through requisitions, taxes, and the conscription of men. In this environment, dissent was a concept fraught with extreme peril. Open defiance of a lord or questioning the authority of the church could lead to severe immediate repercussions, from excommunication to execution. Yet subtle forms of resistance existed. Slowing down work, hiding small portions of harvest from the Lord's due, spreading satirical rumours about an unpopular reeve. These were quiet individual acts of defiance, often invisible to formal historical records, but crucial to the daily psychological survival of the oppressed. You would learn to recognise these nuanced forms of pushback, the unspoken language of a populace, accustomed to enduring rather than overtly confronting. This constant interplay of power, conflict, and subtle dissent would reinforce the delicate tightrope you walked daily. To align yourself with a particular grievance, to speak out even inadvertently, would be to invite disaster. Your survival depended not on taking sides, but on maintaining an almost spectral neutrality, a careful disengagement from the internal conflicts of the medieval world. Your only true fight was the internal one, the battle to remain invisible, to guard your secret, and to navigate the treacherous currents of their society without leaving a trace. This emotional detachment, however necessary, would deepen the well of your unique temporal solitude. The unique temporal solitude, deepened by emotional detachment, however necessary, created a peculiar lens through which you'd begin to perceive even the most universal human experiences, such as birth and death. In your modern world, birth is a sanitized, medicalized event surrounded by expert care and optimistic expectations. In medieval England, however, it was a profoundly dangerous, often communal and deeply superstitious affair. Childbirth was fraught with peril for both mother and child, a brutal testament to the lack of medical knowledge and hygiene. Infant mortality, as you had grimly come to understand, was not an anomaly but a tragic norm. You might witness a birth, a raw, visceral experience in a small, crowded home, followed by immediate anxious prayers and perhaps even folk rituals meant to ward off evil spirits, highlighting the profound reliance on faith and fate over science. Conversely, death was an omnipresent companion integrated into the very fabric of daily life rather than sequestered away in hospitals or funeral homes. The average life expectancy, around 35 years, meant that death was a familiar visitor, cutting lives short with brutal efficiency through disease, famine, childbirth, or violence. You would witness death not as a distant event, but as an immediate personal reality. The bodies of the deceased might be laid out in the home, surrounded by grieving family and neighbours, followed by simple communal burial rites in the churchyard. This constant proximity to mortality would foster a stoicism, a fatalistic acceptance that was profoundly alien to your modern sensibilities, where death is often feared and avoided. The concept of children and childhood would also be strikingly different. While love and affection undoubtedly existed, the harsh realities of survival meant that childhood was often brief and arduous. Children were viewed as miniature adults expected to contribute to household labour from an early age, learning skills necessary for survival and contributing to the family economy. Play as you understood it was less structured, more spontaneous, and often intertwined with practical activities. The immense value placed on a surviving child, given the high mortality rates, would be palpable, yet this love was often expressed through a pragmatic focus on their ability to work and survive rather than on their emotional development or individual fulfillment. Family structures, too, were shaped by economic necessity and survival. Extended families often lived together, pooling resources and labour for mutual support. Marriage was less about romantic love and more about economic alliance, property, and the procreation of heirs. While personal affection could certainly grow within these unions, the primary drivers were pragmatic. The strict gender roles with men primarily engaged in outdoor labour and women managing the household and child-rearing were not merely social constructs, but vital divisions of labour necessary for the household's survival, leaving little room for individual choice or deviation from prescribed roles. Even the simple act of mourning or celebrating life's milestones would carry a different weight. Feasts and wakes were communal affairs serving to reinforce social bonds and provide mutual support in times of both joy and sorrow. These events, often accompanied by traditional songs, stories and simple dances, were deeply ingrained rituals that offered a collective outlet for emotions, a way to process the highs and lows of a life lived on the edge of precariousness. You, the outsider, would observe these rituals, perhaps participate awkwardly, always aware of the subtle nuances you missed, the unspoken histories and relationships that lent these moments their profound meaning. This pervasive integration of birth, life and death into the immediate communal fabric of medieval existence would leave an indelible mark on your soul. You would no longer see these events as separate occurrences, but as threads in a continuous, often brutal tapestry. The fragility of life, the inevitability of death, and the desperate, persistent pulse of human endurance would become profoundly clear, forcing you to reevaluate your own understanding of what it meant to be human, stripping away the layers of modern comfort and artifice to reveal the raw elemental core. This raw elemental core, however, existed within a specific historical and intellectual context, one that informed their understanding of everything from governance to the very nature of existence. That raw elemental core of human existence, stripped of modern comfort and artifice, operated within a specific historical and intellectual context that profoundly shaped how medieval people understood governance, society, and even the very nature of truth. For you, the time traveller grappling with this intellectual framework would be as challenging as navigating the physical landscape. The dominant worldview was deeply theological, with God at the centre of all creation and human existence. The Church was not merely a religious institution. It was the primary source of education, law, and moral authority, its doctrines permeating every aspect of thought. This meant that explanations for natural phenomena, societal order, or personal misfortune often leaned heavily on divine will, sin, or supernatural forces, rather than on empirical observation or scientific inquiry. Learning for the vast majority was practical and vocational, passed down through apprenticeship and oral tradition rather than formal schooling. Literacy was rare outside the clergy, nobility, and some merchant classes. This oral culture meant that stories, histories, and practical knowledge were preserved and transmitted through memory and direct instruction rather than written texts. This would profoundly impact your ability to communicate complex ideas or access information, as the very methods of knowledge transmission were alien. You would come to value the unwritten wisdom of the common folk, their intimate understanding of their immediate world, far more than any academic treatise. The concept of justice, as you had seen, was intrinsically linked to social hierarchy and divine order. A lord's justice was often seen as an extension of God's will, even when it seemed arbitrary or brutal by your standards. There was little room for individual rights as you knew them. Instead, one's rights and responsibilities were largely determined by one's place in the social hierarchy. Peasants owed labour and fealty, lords owed protection and governance, and the Church provided spiritual guidance and moral decree. This intricate web of obligations and expectations, rooted in tradition and perceived divine sanction, maintained a stable, albeit often oppressive, social order. Technological advancement in your modern sense was slow and incremental. Innovation typically arose from practical necessity and was adopted, slowly spreading through observation and imitation rather than systematic research and development. The tools and techniques used in agriculture, craftsmanship and construction were centuries old, honed by generations of trial and error. This slow pace of change, this profound respect for tradition, and established methods would be a stark contrast to the relentless pursuit of novelty and efficiency that characterized your own era. You would witness the power of human ingenuity not in rapid breakthroughs but in the painstaking incremental improvements that slowly reshaped daily life. Even medicine, as you had experienced, operated within a framework of humoral theory and herbal remedies, often infused with superstition and a reliance on divine intervention. The idea of sanitation or germ theory was non-existent. Illness was often attributed to an imbalance of the four humours, blood phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, or the influence of malevolent spirits. Treatment involved bleeding, purging herbal concoctions, and crucially prayer. This approach, while often ineffective by modern standards, was deeply rational within their own intellectual context, a holistic understanding of the body and its relationship to the natural and spiritual worlds. This profound difference in intellectual underpinning, this distinct way of knowing and understanding the world, would be one of the most isolating aspects of your time travel. You could observe their customs, adapt to their daily routines, and mimic their behaviours, but truly sharing their worldview, their fundamental assumptions about reality would remain an insurmountable barrier. You would forever be a person of a different epoch, a mind shaped by science and reason, dropped into a world steeped in faith tradition and a cyclical view of time. This profound intellectual solitude would be a constant quiet hum beneath the surface of your medieval existence, a reminder that you were not merely displaced in space but fundamentally in mind. That profound intellectual solitude, a constant quiet hum beneath the surface of your medieval existence, extended to the very concepts of freedom and individuality, which were profoundly different from your modern understanding. In your era, freedom often meant autonomy, the ability to choose your path, your career, your beliefs. In medieval England, true freedom was a rare commodity largely confined to the nobility or the select few who managed to escape serfdom and live in chartered towns. For the vast majority, life was defined by obligations to their lord, to their family, to their community, and to God. This wasn't necessarily seen as oppression, but as the natural order, a system of reciprocal duties that ensured collective survival in a harsh world. Individuality, too, was understood within a collective framework. While unique personalities certainly existed, the emphasis was on one's role within the larger social fabric. Your identity was largely defined by your lineage, your trade, your parish. There was little room for self-expression or personal ambition that strayed too far from these predefined paths. To stand out, to be too unique, was often a perilous endeavour, inviting suspicion and potentially ostracism. This stark contrast with your modern emphasis on personal identity and self-actualization would force a profound re-evaluation of what it meant to be a person, stripping away the layers of individual choice you once took for granted. The limitations on movement were another tangible expression of this lack of modern freedom. While not strictly imprisoned, peasants were often tied to the land they worked, requiring permission from their lord to leave. Travel for anyone was arduous and dangerous, making long journeys a rarity for most commoners. The world was intensely local, with most people living and dying within a few miles of their birthplace. This restricted physical mobility reinforced the static nature of society and the limited horizons of daily life, making your own ability to traverse time and space an almost unimaginable marvel to them. Even personal safety, a fundamental modern right, was often precarious and dependent on your affiliation. As you had learned, there was no comprehensive law enforcement system to protect the individual from arbitrary violence or theft. Justice, when it came, was often brutal and inconsistent. Your safety was largely derived from your belonging to a recognized household or community, or from the protection of a powerful lord. This constant vulnerability, this reliance on informal networks for protection, would redefine your understanding of security, replacing the abstract concept of rights with the tangible reality of belonging. The concept of knowledge and intellectual freedom was similarly constrained. Access to books was severely limited and literacy was rare. Information was controlled, often disseminated through the church or ruling elites. Questioning established dogma or challenging authority, especially religious authority, could lead to severe consequences, including heresy charges. This intellectual environment, where truth was often divinely revealed and dissent was suppressed, would feel stifling to a mind accustomed to open inquiry and the free exchange of ideas, adding another layer to your profound intellectual solitude. Ultimately, your experience in medieval England would strip away many of the assumptions about freedom and individuality that underpinned your modern identity. You would learn that survival often meant conforming, that security came from belonging, and that personal choice was a luxury rather than a given. This forced adaptation, this quiet surrender to the prevailing social and intellectual structures, would leave you with a profound, if melancholic, appreciation for the freedoms you had once possessed. It was a world where you were not defined by what you chose to be, but by where you were born, to whom you belonged, and how quietly you could disappear into the tapestry of their collective existence. That quiet disappearance into the tapestry of their collective existence would ultimately culminate in a profound internal reckoning. After experiencing medieval England not through books or screens, but through the raw, unvarnished reality of your own body and mind, your understanding of history would be irrevocably altered. No longer a collection of dates and names, it would become a visceral memory of cold hunger and constant vigilance. The romantic notions of knights and castles would be overshadowed by the aching reality of blistered hands, the pervasive stench of unwashed humanity, and the relentless gnawing anxiety of being an outsider in a world that had no clear place for you. The very concept of progress would gain a new stark meaning. Amenities you once dismissed as mundane, a clean glass of water, a hot shower, a painkiller, even a simple uninterrupted night's sleep, would transform into luxuries of almost unimaginable value. You would understand, perhaps for the first time, the sheer ingenuity and collective effort that went into building the comforts of your own era. This isn't just about appreciation, it's about a deep cellular understanding of the historical journey humanity has undertaken, a journey paid for in the small daily privations that you had now personally endured. Every modern convenience would be a quiet miracle, a testament to centuries of incremental hard-won advancements that medieval people could only dream of if they could even conceive of them. Your own internal landscape would shift dramatically. The frantic pace and constant demands of modern life, once your reality, would now seem oddly superficial, almost trivial in comparison to the elemental struggle for survival you had known. The deep stillness of a medieval night, broken only by the hoot of an owl or the rustle of straw, would forever contrast with the ambient hum of your modern world. You would carry with you the memory of the ubiquitous pottage, the chilling vulnerability to disease, and the pervasive awareness of a social hierarchy that determined every aspect of one's fate. These memories would not fade but integrate, forming a new profound layer of understanding within your consciousness. The lessons learned would be etched not just in memory, but in the fibre of your being. The critical importance of silence, the subtle art of deference, the constant performance of unremarkableness. These survival strategies born of desperate necessity would linger. You would forever be attuned to unspoken social cues, to the hidden power dynamics in any interaction, perhaps even to the subtle scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The world would seem both more complicated and remarkably simpler, stripped down to its core elements of human connection, basic needs, and the relentless march of time. This journey, though perhaps a mere mental exercise for you now, would leave an indelible mark. It's a reminder that history isn't just about grand events or famous figures. It's about the countless anonymous lives lived in the mud, under the watchful eyes of their lords, battling the elements and unseen microbes and finding moments of quiet joy or grim acceptance amidst pervasive hardship. It is in these intimate details, these personal realities of daily existence, that the past truly breathes, offering a profound counterpoint to the hurried comforts of our own time. As the echoes of those medieval days begin to soften and drift, a new quiet understanding settles over you, inviting you back to the peace of the present. As the echoes of those medieval days begin to soften and drift, allow your mind to gently disengage from the mud, the cold and the pervasive scent of wood smoke. The distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer fades, replaced now by the quiet hum of your own present, a comforting familiar sound that reassures you of where and when you truly are. Let the images of splintered wooden bowls and constantly damp clothes recede as you feel the soft texture of your own bedding, the warmth of your room, the quiet solace of your modern space. Remember the profound longing for clean running water, the simple miracle of a tap. Cherish the thought of a warm bath, the soft feel of clean fabrics against your skin, and the silent, invisible protection of modern medicine. These are not just conveniences, they are the quiet triumphs of centuries, the accumulated peace that allows your world to operate so differently from the one we've just explored. The struggles for basic sustenance, for warmth, for an unspoken place within a rigid society, these are now distant murmurs, whispers from a time bravely endured. Allow the quiet, unassuming strength of those who lived in medieval England to settle gently in your thoughts, a testament to resilience, a profound reminder of the human spirit's enduring capacity to adapt and survive. Feel the comforting stillness of your own room, now the safety and predictability that envelop you, a stark and precious contrast to the unpredictable realities of the past. As your consciousness drifts further, let any lingering thoughts of ancient challenges dissipate, replaced by a deep sense of peace. The journey back through time is complete. Now only comfort and quiet remain.